Hey everybody, welcome back to Baking with Rosehill Sourdough. This is Mike, and today I'm going to be walking you through the beginner's sourdough bread recipe. It's one of my favorite recipes for beginners because it's a very low hydration dough, which means that there's not a lot of water that's used, and so the dough typically for beginners is a lot easier to work with. You're not going to find it as sticky as maybe some of those higher hydration doughs when you're first handling it, and it gives you a good step-by-step process how to make sourdough bread. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with 155 grams of warm water. This water I want somewhere between 90 degrees and 100 degrees Fahrenheit because I want my final dough temperature to between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. To that, I'm going to add 5 grams of salt. I'm just going to gently whirl around the water to dissolve the salt. After the salt's dissolved, I'm going to add my 60 grams of sourdough starter that I fed 8 to 12 hours ago until it's doubled in volume. Once my sourdough is added, I'm just going to use this spatula to break up the sourdough. I don't need to completely dissolve it or anything. I just want to start breaking it up so it's easier to incorporate the flour. You'll know when it's ready when the water starts to turn milky in color. All right, now I'm ready to add my flour. This is 255 grams of unbleached bread flour, and I'm going to use my spatula to stir everything together. Now at this point, I'm not trying to knead the dough or build any structure in the dough. I'm simply just stirring to incorporate all of the ingredients. This is a pretty dry dough, so it might become a little bit too difficult to stir with your spatula. At that point, just set the spatula to the side and work it by hand. Again, you're not trying to knead the dough or anything. You're just trying to incorporate all of the flour into the dough, and you'll know when it's ready when there's no more dry flour left. And the dough looks something like this. At this point, we're gonna do a quick temperature check. I wanna be between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm right around 77 degrees, which is great. Now I'm gonna pop a wet towel or a lid on my bowl, and I'm gonna set a timer for 1 hour, and I'm gonna move this to somewhere warm in my house so it continue to sit between that 70 and 80 degrees temperature. All right, so it's been an hour. I'm gonna open up this dough, and you can see that's a little bit sticky. In order to avoid the dough sticking to my hands, I'm just gonna wet my hands a little bit with some water. Basically, I'm just taking a little bit of water and dipping my fingertips in, and then rubbing my hands together. That's all the water you'll need. You don't need your hands to be really wet, you just need them to be a little bit moist. Okay, now that my hands are wet, I'm gonna start to work this dough. This first stretch is gonna be called a stretch and fold. And you'll see why. You're gonna gently pinch an edge of the dough and stretch it upwards, and fold it back onto itself over the center of the dough and press it down into the dough. And I'm going to continue to do this stretching and folding all the way around the entire circumference of the dough about 10 times until a ball starts to form. At that point, I'm going to gently pinch the edge of the dough and lift it up out of the bowl. I'm going to fold the dough back onto itself, and then curl the dough under and press with my hands to continue to build a smooth and a seam side of my dough. The smooth side is going to be on top, and the seam side is going to be on the bottom at the end of this fold. So now that I've got something that resembles a smooth ball, I'm going to let this dough rest for another hour. So I'll cover it with a wet towel or a lid, and I'll set a timer for 1 hour and store it again in a warm part of my house. All right, now that it's been an hour, I'm going to do another fold on my dough here. I'm going to use the fingertip technique to get some wet hands, and then I'm going to do the tuck and rotate technique. I'm going to lift the dough up out of the bowl, going to just tuck the edges of the dough up into the center. Remember, we created that seam and smooth side of our dough? All we're doing now is creating more of a seam and a smooth side. It's smoothing out that dough and adding some structure. Just going to gently rotate around the dough, pulling the edges gently and tucking them up into the center, and using the edges of my hands to form a little dough ball. I'm gonna pop that back down into my bowl, cover it, set a timer for 1 more hour. So it's been another hour. I'm gonna do my last fold here and get ready to let this dough rest to do its final proving. So I'm gonna use wet hands, and I'm gonna gently remove the dough from the bowl, give it one last tuck and rotate just to form a nice smooth ball and that seam side down. After I've got it into a ball, I'm going to place it onto a piece of trimmed parchment paper, and I'm going to cover the dough with that same bowl that we were just using for mixing. Now I'm going to let the dough rest here for 2 hours before placing it into the refrigerator for a 3.5 hour rest. So after the dough's been in the fridge for about 2.5 hours or so, you're going to want to prep your oven for baking. Go ahead and preheat your oven to 450 degrees with your cast iron Dutch oven inside your oven. I like to let my oven set a temperature for a while, even after preheating, just to make sure that cast iron is nice and hot. After 3.5 hours, we're going to take the dough out of the refrigerator, and we're going to prep it for baking. So remove the bowl from over the top of the dough and gently sprinkle the dough with flour. The more flour you add, the more contrast you're going to get from your scoring, but you want your flour to be nice and smooth so you don't have any caked flour on top of your bread when it's done baking. So go ahead and smooth it out, and then dump the excess flour off to the side. I like to score using this style bread lame from Wire Monkey Shop. It's called the UFO, and it lets me get nice and close to the bread. Now when you're scoring, remember that the depth of the score is going to relate to how wide the bread spreads at that location. So in this scoring, I'm just doing some simple grain stalks, and I'm trying to score at the same depth so that all of the spreads are the same distance. Now that my bread is scored, I'm going to get my Dutch oven out of the oven and place my bread in it, give it a little shake just to center it in the Dutch oven, cover it, put it in the oven for 35 minutes. After 35 minutes, I'm going to uncover the bread, and I'm going to put it back in the oven for another 12 minutes so that crust can get nice and crunchy. After 12 minutes, here's what it looks like. I'm gonna grab a cooling rack, I'm gonna put my bread on it, I'm gonna set a timer for 1 hour. I found that if I try to cut into the bread too early, it can make the bread a little bit gummy, so I like to let it sit and rest for a full hour before cutting into it. So now it's been an hour, I'm gonna go ahead and cut into this bread. I like to use gentle pressure and move back and forth a couple times until I get to the bottom crust, then I use firm pressure to cut through the bottom. And here's what the crumb looks like. Exactly what we're looking for, a nice, even crumb. Here's the recipe once again and the final product. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you'd like any more of my tips and tricks, please follow me on Instagram at Rosehill Sourdough, and I hope to see you back here again soon.